My name is Spenser Brenner, and we're here at the Reece Museum, where I'm the exhibition coordinator. And we are standing in Gallery A, which currently has a former exhibit that we are right now in the process of kind of reinventing into the latter part of, or the full exhibit space here. So what we're looking at behind me is half of something that we entitled Gov Hub, which was part of the Governor's School for the Scientific Exploration of Tennessee Heritage. It was held here through the Center of Excellence of Appalachian Studies and Services. It involved around 30 high school students from across the state of Tennessee, and they were here to explore the culture of Tennessee heritage, working with professors, learning Tennessee history. They got to visit a number of different sites, other museums. And our part here at the Reece Museum, we got the opportunity to work with the students in interpreting and looking at our own artifacts from our permanent collection downstairs. Museum staff created these installation pieces, and we'll talk a little bit more about what inspired those. But we're kind of looking at kind of the ancestors, the ideas of home and place, and kind of what remnants of the past a little bit, while interjecting our own kind of personal stories there. So we have small little sections each here throughout this side of the exhibit space, and what we did was we worked with Jesse Graves and Scott Honeycutt, both associated with the Literature and Language Department here. Scott Honeycutt, who's a professor, he was, I believe, the main instructor, I guess would be his title, for Governor's School this year. So he had that literary approach, and he was working with Jesse Graves' new book, or rather the new release of his book, Tennessee Landscape with Blighted Pine. It's a book of poetry that Jesse wrote. So using select poems that were identified by Scott Honeycutt, the students read these poems, looked at these installations, and reinterpreted the artifacts while identifying aspects of that literary connection. So, and the end result were these text panels that we put together, those students that actually had the poem, which in this case, Late Summer Woodcut, and this is in reference to this area, which is kind of, for lack of better terms, like, Pathpaw's workshop is kind of what we were kind of alluding to, and this was what Becker Proffitt, our director, who put together this aspect of the Gov Hub, called Inspo Photos. So we have that there, we have the writing, we have the students that wrote it, and the poetry. So it's a really interesting way to learn about our artifacts, learn about history, but it's kind of a lack of context. It's a new context. But again, there's a familiarity to it, and a family sense to it. There's a lot of connections to home. But beyond that, we're able to bring up really interesting artifacts that sometimes, in a lack of a better way of saying it, in our eclectic collection, sometimes we have these one-off interesting pieces that might not find an opportunity to be on display. And this was an exciting opportunity that we got to show off of many, many different artifacts. For instance, our corner case back there hasn't been on display in a number of years, and we were just thrilled just to have it up, but then to actually feel it and actually kind of breathe more life into it. So it was fascinating to have the students in here, have them working with these artifacts, and it was really fun for us to kind of create these installations as a museum staff. So we called it a creative laboratory in the sense that they were actually creating art, but they were also working with literary art and cultural art pieces to reinterpret and kind of interject some new life into what this exhibit was, which is Gov Hub. Now, we love this so much that we kind of scrapped our ideas for a new exhibit that was going to essentially open this week. So instead of taking this down, we were very impressed with the writing, and we were so happy with what the end result of this installation was. We continued to work with Jesse Graves, the poet, to identify other poetry pieces and then continue the installation. And as you can see right now, it's a work in progress, but we have another kind of scene, a living room scene, if you will, but it's very different in contrast to our other fireplace scene. So there's some different kind of socioeconomic status. Maybe these artifacts are a little more curated. Maybe it's a different time frame. and then moving forward into it, eventually wicker couch will live here that I'm going to lend the museum once I paint it the appropriate colors so it will actually fit the aesthetic. Then, of course, we thought this would be a fun opportunity to bring up a steel and work with Jesse to talk about maybe some more aspects of that ancestral ties to Appalachia. And so we are put this together. Again, this is another artifact that hasn't been able to come up on display. And we've actually had the opportunity to work with, I believe it's Tennessee Hills, the distillery, or brew distillery rather, and work with them to make sure we're putting it up appropriately, and also to kind of help them as they're going to be our partners moving forward in some other research and artifact endeavors. And then finally, even though we have a few artifacts here, it's going to kind of bleed into and more of an agricultural aspect, looking at maybe some farm equipment, something that will address like Grandpa's workshop over there, but this would be more the outside of the barn, the more agricultural trade of it. So again, we are putting those things together. It'll officially kind of open next week, we believe Monday, and we're going to have booklets that will have all of these writings in them, so you can actually walk around the gallery and you'll be able to reference these things. Of course, you'll have museum staff that will be here to kind of act as docents. So if you really wanted to know who was the artist behind that landscape, or if you really wanted to know who donated the steel, we of course would have that information. But it's not explicitly laid out there. There's no text panels really for you to have to read. It's come in, experience, and kind of find your own connection. And then if you want some context, we have some wonderful poetry and some also interpretive ideas of our younger generation. So we're really fascinated with this and happy to have it here.
Hi, we're here at the Reece Museum with Becca. Becca, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Becca Proffitt, the director at the Reece Museum, formerly the collections manager. So I've been here since 2019.
Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the Gov Hub, as it's called right now, exhibit space. And right behind us is part of that exhibit. So the first thing I want to talk about is how this came together. So we were talking about this, it's kind of backwards a little bit. So this exhibit kind of came together going from object to theme instead of theme to object. How did that work?
Well, I have a book called Tasteful Interludes, which contains photos of interiors from the Victorian era, and I have been fascinated with that book for a number of years, and I've had the idea that I wanted to show living spaces using what we have in the collections. We have a lot of things from that time period, but I could never really figure out what the exhibit would look like. It just didn't, I couldn't put together in my mind, you know, what the theme would be or how it would work. And so I've just kind of had this percolating idea for a couple years. And then we started working with the Gov Hub group. So that's the governor's school, which is on campus each summer, and it's high school students. And the director of that program, Scott Honeycutt, from the Literature and Language Department, told me that they were using Jesse Graves' poetry book as their theme for governor's school this year. And I thought, well, that would be perfect. So I asked him to pick out some poems that we could use to incorporate a curating and interpreting component to what Governor's School was doing with the poems. And so he selected 6 poems, and then we decided from the poems how to create spaces that would give a physical representation to the mood and the topic of each poem.
Which is really cool and fascinating for me, who's worked with education and students in museum spaces. It's a really cool intersection to have physical space in a museum tied to literary content to reach students. So how do you feel like the students responded to that?
I mean, they seem to enjoy themselves. And, you know, we told it to them that, you know, I was their curator, so I was kind of in charge of how it was going to look and how it was all going to happen. And Spenser Brenner, who's our exhibition coordinator, he kind of physically, you know, made the spaces happen. And then the students, we sort of expected them to be our research assistants and our interpretive writers for the spaces. So we just gave them the poems, and then I gave them a list of objects that I knew I wanted to include in each kind of segment of the spaces. And then we just had them come into the room as the exhibition developed. So we put out several anchor pieces, 3 or 4 things, and kind of showed them how we're dividing the space, read through the poems and talked about what we were hoping to accomplish, and then we just said, write something. And so they wrote kind of a response to the physical area, reading the poem and trying to help the visitor understand what they were experiencing. So we were trying to help them kind of dip their toes into that interpretive style of writing.
Yeah, which is so essential to museum work.
Yes.
And contrary to what some people think about museums, a lot of people think it's just museums are just a bunch of stuff.
Right.
The anchor and the interpretation part is such an important aspect of that.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the stuff in this, a lot of the stuff came from y'all's own collection, correct?
Our museum collection and our personal collections as well.
Yes.
Yes.
So what do you mean by personal collections?
I mean, the funnest part about doing an exhibit like this is that we select some big ideas and some main anchor points, and then we just shop the collection. We go downstairs and we say, oh, this would be great, that would be great, but we always find that there's some holes. There's some things we wish we had, or a couple more of these things would be perfect. So we all brought things from home, like the 2 lamps on the mantelpiece. I drove over to my mom's house and I said, could I please borrow Nanny's lamps for this exhibit that we're working on? And one of the main things in the entirety of Jesse's books is ancestors and our connection with people through places and storytelling. So a lot of the things that you see in the exhibit belong to like my family, my grandmother, Spenser's family, one of his grandmothers. So a lot of the things that we see on our ancestor wall over here are our own personal ancestors. So we wanted that really to come through, that feeling that it's really personal and really connected to our own history and story. And it's a universal experience. It's not just Jesse's poetry and our stuff, but it's got the vibe of going to grandma's house for everybody who comes to experience it.
Yeah. So you mentioned the ancestor wall.
Mm-hmm.
Where did those images come from that are on the ancestor wall?
Well, when you read one of Jesse's poems, he talks about going to visit an uncle's house, and the uncle has basically wallpapered his home with images of different things. And so the first thing that came to our mind was the old farmhouse where they used to insulate with newspapers, and they would cover the walls with I guess they use wallpaper paste, just like wallpaper. So the base layer of our ancestor wall are newspaper clippings that I collected when I was researching suffrage organization in Johnson City. So they all date to between 1900 and about 1920. And we supplemented that then with images from the Jack Schrader collection, he was a photographer who was the chair of the Department of Art and Design back in the 70s and 80s. So there's a lot of images that he took of different people and places. And then on top of that, we put images of our own families. So there are several framed photos of my grandparents, some of my aunts and uncles. Spenser is up there as a child. There's a few photos of like me and my mom. And my sister was a baby. There's baby photos of us. Yeah. And then Mara Reynolds, our digital access coordinator, she brought in some really interesting images of her family. There's one, I think it's her grandfather with a squirrel on his shoulder. So, we just had a good time bringing in things that felt special and interesting and unique about our families to add to the wall.
Which is another really cool tie to a bunch of overlapping things just in one space. But kind of back to your point about filling things in. One of the things that Spenser was talking about when he was looking around the exhibit, things like the flooring in the I guess this is Papaw's workshop.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
If you're in a museum and you're putting together an exhibit, where can you get materials or fabrication materials? If you can't always just go out and get new things, right? So how do you recommend using either extra items on hand or extra items from former exhibits? How do you recommend you incorporating that stuff?
Well, we just keep everything. I mean, I don't know if you're a maker, if you're an artist, I know you'll get that. We just keep everything.
Yeah.
You know, this came from a capital improvement project that was done like 15 years ago,
Yeah.
and it's leftovers from that, and we just happened to have it. And you know, I bought the brick at Home Depot.
Yeah.
And I mean, we just make it work. You know, here and there, we do invest in things that we know we can use over and over again. Like, I'm going to buy some fabric that's time period appropriate, and then we'll just call it exhibition furniture. So over the years, we've just collected things by spending carefully here and there, and then by just knowing that if it's cool, we want to keep it.
Yeah, and that's such a good thing for a lot of museums. Can feel overwhelmed with like constantly like having to get new things or like not having new things. But sometimes if you have space to keep extra material and long-term investment in something that's multi-use can be good.
Absolutely. We have an attic, and we just, you know, we've got like piles and piles of frames, and that's where we keep our rugs that we let visitors walk on. That's not part of the collection. The fabric and things like that would probably go up there. The flooring stays up there. So we just have a little cache of goodies to dig through whenever we're trying to, you know, and it's all about thinking creatively, you know, just using what you have to the best of your ability.
Yeah, and even if it's something as simple as saying, like, I've got this table in my workshop and we need a second table, like maybe like even something like that can be helpful.
Yes.
But I think the last thing I want to talk about is how, first off, how much work has gone into this so far.
Oh gosh, hours and hours. I mean, selecting the poems, because, you know, Scott gave us a lot of poems and we kind of whittled it down to the ones we wanted to focus on. So deciding on which poems would work best with what I knew we had available to use was a long time period. Then researching the artifacts so that I could give the students information to work with. And I mean, really, I started thinking about this concept a full 3 years ago. So just kind of thinking and percolating and allowing my creative mind to wander, you know, it's been years in the making.
Which sometimes ideas take, like, you'll have a good idea, but it's not quite right. Or like you don't have the time to think about it, but it's just there for a while and then it comes
in the
out.
background.
So how long was this originally supposed to be up for?
About a month. And then once we put the amount of work into it and saw how good it looked, and also the response that it got from Jesse Graves, the author of the book, he loved it, and we thought, well, let's just run with it, because we needed something. We were going to do a collections-based exhibit after this, but we didn't have kind of a fully formed exhibit. We just had some ideas, and we thought, let's just continue on, expand the idea, and go all out. You know?
I think that's one of the most important, like, museum sort of behind the scenes museum things that we can take from this exhibit is, first off, exhibit work, exhibit design concept, just before you even get into the actual implementation phase, can take sometimes years, like you mentioned. And then so when you are putting that much work into it, if you come up with a end result that looks like this, it would almost be a shame to tear it down after a month. Not to mention the amount of work that it's a quick turnaround and you're putting something else in. So being flexible with your timetable can be a good thing. But also, if you sit back and there's, in this case, you mentioned Jesse, like that's a different layer to this. Like, you've got someone whose work has kind of inspired this, is so impressed with it. Like, that's an added layer. But just in general, you and Spenser and the staff here puts this out, and then you sit back and like, this looks really good. And you have the student input. That can help make your decision for you.
Yes.
And so you still have, like, we were looking around, there's still like half an exhibit space to go. And as we mentioned, this is an exhibit in process. But when you have something that's that good and that you're that proud of and has this personal element to it, and then you've got the Jesse Graves element, make sure that you give your audience time to enjoy the very hard fruits of your labor as well. I think that's an important lesson to take here. So now that this is not going to be down in a month, how long is this exhibit going to be up for?
I couldn't tell you the exact date, Spenser can tell you, but I believe September. I think we're gonna keep it up through the fall so that Jesse has a chance to bring his classes here to do some work in person with his book.
Which is another benefit for this museum being here on campus of ETSU, that you can work with, language arts or history department or app studies, and kind of like the hub of all those things, like sort of coming here.
It's set to open next week.
Okay.
The exhibit, the physical exhibit will be ready to view, and the gallery guide will probably be finished up in the middle of next week. But you can visit it and see it as is.
Yeah, I just walked in today, just started walking around in here. So, but yeah, so keep an eye out for that exhibit when it opens, and it will be open through September. Becca, thank you so much. This has been Exhibit Extras. Keep an eye out for this exhibit opening and other stuff we have going on.